You are on HOA checkmate. I stayed calm and let her talk. Karen jabbed her finger at a setback mark and yelled that I crossed it, and she would report it as an easement issue. You are making this easy for me, she said, grinning like she had already won. I stood there in the drizzle with my hood pulled tight, watching her plant another orange stake in my yard like she owned the place. This was Janet Harris, board secretary for the Heights at Summit Ridge HOA Incorporated, and she had decided my fence was her personal crusade. We were in Billings, Montana, in a neighborhood where gray areas equal HOA power grabs, and I was about to lose a contractor window and a cancellation fee if she did not back off. I work as a rideshare fleet coordinator, scheduling drivers and vehicles around the clock, and I was already on probation at a new job. I could not afford to miss work for HOA hearings. Janet did not care. She waved a printed packet at me and said the setback was violated by 4 inches, and she had photos to prove it. I told her the city confirmed my fence was legal. She laughed and said, "I do not need proof. I have paperwork and vibes." That line hit me like a slap. I pulled out my small notepad with wet pages and started writing. Every word. Because later I planned to read them back to her. The fence contractor was scheduled for a tight morning window, and if Janet stopped the work, we would pay a cancellation fee. That was the time pressure hanging over my head. She knew it. She had timed this ambush perfectly. My friend Eric, a CPA who had helped me review the HOA ledger last week, had spotted red flags in the enforcement entries. Duplicate dates. Fees that did not match the covenant amounts. Janet had been playing fast and loose with the paperwork for months. But proving it in the moment, standing in wet grass with a landscaping contractor pretending not to listen from his truck 20 feet away, was another problem entirely. Janet turned to the contractor and shouted that if he touched one post, she would call the police and report unpermitted work. The contractor, a guy named Mike, leaned out his window and said his permit was valid and filed with the county. Janet screamed that the county did not matter because the HOA covenant superseded local codes. That was a lie. I knew it. Mike knew it. But Mike also knew he had 3 more jobs that day, and he was not going to sit here and argue with a board secretary in the rain. Mike drove off. Janet smiled and said, "Smile, I am documenting this for the file." She held up her phone and snapped a photo of me standing there with my hood up and my notepad dripping. I asked her what file. She said the enforcement file that would go to the management company and result in a lien if I did not remove the fence within 7 days. I told her the fence was not even installed yet. She said the contractor truck being parked on the street was commercial activity, and that alone was a violation. She pointed at the curb where Mike had been idling. No truck now, just wet asphalt. But she had her photo. That was enough for Janet. She turned and walked toward her house, orange stakes still tucked under her arm like trophies. I stood there feeling the rain soak through my jacket and realized this was going to get worse before it got better. I went inside and called Eric. He told me to document everything and to check the HOA covenant language on contractor parking. I pulled up the PDF and searched. Nothing. Contractor parking was not mentioned. Commercial vehicles over a certain weight required approval, but a standard pickup did not qualify. Janet had invented the rule on the spot. Eric said that was classic HOA overreach, and I should file a written dispute with the management company immediately. I drafted the email that night, attached the covenant section, and sent it to the management company with a request for written clarification. No response. I followed up 2 days later. Still nothing. Then I got a violation notice in the mail. It was dated 3 days before the confrontation with Janet. The photo was from that morning. The dates did not match. I called Eric and told him. He said to keep that notice because it was evidence of tampering. I scanned it and saved 3 copies. The fence contractor called and said he could reschedule for next week, but the cancellation fee was already billed. $200 gone. I asked if he could hold the slot if I got written clearance from the HOA. He said he would try, but his schedule was tight. I needed that clearance fast. I called the management company and got voicemail. I left a message. No callback. I drove to their office in person. The receptionist said the HOA manager was in a meeting. I said I would wait. I sat in the lobby for 90 minutes with my notepad and a Ziploc bag of dirt and grass Janet had brought to a prior meeting as evidence of my lawn being too dry. She had labeled it with a date and my address. The manager finally came out, and I showed him the violation notice with the backdated timestamp. He looked at it and said he would check the records. I asked when. He said within 5 business days. That was not good enough. My contractor window was in 4 days. I told him I needed an answer today. He said that was not possible. I asked to see the enforcement file. He said it was confidential. I asked how a file could be confidential if it was being used to find me. He did not have an answer for that. I left and called a local attorney who handled HOA disputes. She quoted me $1,500 to send a demand letter. I did not have $1,500. I thanked her and hung up. Janet escalated. She sent a second notice demanding proof in a format they never mentioned until today. She wanted a survey, a signed contractor affidavit, proof of permit filing, and a letter from the city confirming setback compliance, all within 72 hours. The survey alone would take a week to schedule. I called the city planning office and explained the situation. The clerk was sympathetic, but said they could not issue a letter without an active dispute filed with the county. I asked what that meant. She said I would need to file a formal complaint and wait for a hearing. That could take months. I told her I had 4 days before the contractor walked. She said she was sorry, but there was nothing she could do. I hung up and stared at my kitchen table covered in printouts and notes. That was when I remembered the trump card. 6 months earlier, Janet had walked onto my property without permission and tried to photograph my back gate. A neighbor had called the police. The officer who responded had written an incident report and given me the case number. I had filed it away thinking it was over, but now I realized it was proof of a pattern. Janet had done this before. She had trespassed, harassed, and fabricated violations before. The incident report was dated and signed by an officer. It was real. I pulled the file and made copies. I sent the incident report to the management company as an attachment to my second dispute email. I wrote that Janet had a documented history of trespassing and harassment, and that her current enforcement actions appeared retaliatory. I cited the covenant section on board member conduct and asked for an immediate review. This time I got a response within 2 hours. The HOA manager called me directly. He said he had reviewed the file and agreed the backdated notice was a clerical error. He said he would issue a correction. I asked when. He said within a week. I told him my contractor was scheduled in 3 days, and I needed written clearance now. He sighed and said he would email me a temporary clearance letter by end of business. I thanked him and hung up. The letter arrived at 4:47 p.m. It was one paragraph. It said the fence installation could proceed pending final inspection. Good enough. I forwarded it to the contractor. He confirmed the slot was still open. The morning of the installation, Janet was waiting in my driveway. She had a clipboard and a tape measure. She said the clearance letter was invalid because it did not specify setback dimensions. I told her the setback was already confirmed by the city. She said the city was wrong and the HOA covenant took precedence. I asked her to show me the covenant language. She flipped through her clipboard and could not find it. She said it was in the supplemental rules. I asked to see the supplemental rules. She said they were not published yet. I asked how I could be in violation of unpublished rules. She did not answer. The contractor truck pulled up. Mike got out with his post hole digger and a bundle of stakes. Janet stepped in front of him and said he was not authorized to proceed. Mike looked at me. I showed him the clearance letter on my phone. He nodded and started unloading. Janet started yelling. "Smile. I am documenting this for the file," she said again, snapping photos of Mike and his equipment. Mike ignored her. I stood between them and told Janet she was trespassing. She said the easement gave her the right to be there. I asked her to show me the easement map. She did not have one. I told her to leave, or I would call the police. She laughed and said the police would not come for an HOA dispute. I pulled out my phone and dialed. She stared at me. I put the call on speaker. The dispatcher answered. I explained the situation. The dispatcher said an officer would be out shortly. Janet turned and walked back to her property. But she did not go inside. She stood at her fence line with her phone up, recording everything. If you are enjoying this wild HOA chaos, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss the next story where the rules backfire in spectacular fashion. The officer arrived 20 minutes later. I explained the history. I showed him the clearance letter, the incident report from 6 months ago, and the backdated violation notice. He listened and took notes. Then he walked over to Janet. She immediately launched into a speech about covenant enforcement and property values. The officer let her finish, and then asked if she had an easement map. She said it was on file with the HOA. He asked if she had a copy. She did not. He asked if she had permission to be on my property. She said the easement gave her standing. He told her that was not the same as permission, and if I asked her to leave, she needed to leave. She argued. He repeated himself. She finally went inside. The officer came back to me and said he could not do anything about the HOA dispute, but if she came onto my property again without permission, I should call immediately. I thanked him. He left. Mike started drilling the first post hole. Janet came back out while the auger was running. She screamed something about the property line. Nobody could hear her over the machine. Mike kept drilling. She walked right up to the hole and pointed at the ground. Mike shut off the auger. The sudden silence was jarring. Janet said the hole was 6 inches over the line and she had proof. She pulled out an orange stake and tried to plant it next to the hole. The ground was too hard. The stake bent. She threw it down and said she would file an emergency injunction. Mike looked at me. I told him to keep going. He fired up the auger again. Janet stood there screaming into the noise. A landscaping contractor working on a lawn 2 houses down glanced over but kept edging. He was pretending not to listen. Everyone in this neighborhood had learned to ignore Janet. By noon, 4 posts were in. Mike started setting the panels. Janet came back out with a printed packet. The pages were stapled and highlighted. She said she had found the easement language and I was in violation. I asked to see it. She held it up but would not let me touch it. I took a photo of the page with my phone. The text was blurry, but I could make out enough to see it was from a different subdivision. The map reference did not match our plat. I pointed that out. She said it was the same developer and the rules applied. I told her that was not how property law worked. She said she would let the judge decide. I asked what judge. She said the one who would hear her injunction. I asked when she filed it. She did not answer. There was no injunction. She was bluffing. Mike finished the 4th panel and started measuring for the 5th. Janet walked up with her tape measure and demanded her own test. Mike sighed and handed her his tape. She pulled it across the fence line and called out numbers. They matched his measurements. She tried again. Same result. She said the tape was wrong. Mike took it back and kept working. The side complication hit that afternoon. I checked my email and saw a message from the management company. They had lost my dispute packet. Both copies. The one I mailed and the one I emailed. They asked me to resend everything. I replied with the attachments again and asked for confirmation of receipt. No reply. I called. Voicemail. I called again an hour later. The receptionist said the manager was out for the day. I asked when he would be back. She said Monday. It was Thursday. I told her this was urgent. She said she would leave a message. I hung up and called Eric. He told me to send the packet to the board president and CC the entire board using the emails listed on the HOA website. I did that immediately. Within 30 minutes, I got a reply from the treasurer asking why I was bothering the board with management issues. I replied with a timeline of non-responses and the backdated notice. No reply. But I knew they had seen it. Mike finished the fence by 3 p.m. It looked great. Level, square, the right height, and clearly inside the setback line. I walked the length with my phone and took photos from every angle. Janet came out and said she was filing a formal complaint with the county. I told her to go ahead. She said the fence was ugly and hurt property values. I told her the covenant allowed my fence style. She said the covenant was old and the board had updated the standards. I asked for a copy of the updated standards. She said they were not published yet. The same excuse as before. I told her unpublished rules were not enforceable. She said the board had discretion. I asked her to show me where the covenant gave the board discretion to enforce unpublished rules. She walked away. That night, Eric came over to review the ledger audit he had been working on. He spread printouts across my kitchen table and pointed at 3 entries. All 3 were enforcement actions against me. All 3 had fees that did not match the covenant schedule. One was dated before I even bought the house. Eric said this was either gross incompetence or intentional fraud. He said I should file a formal complaint with the state HOA ombudsman. I asked if that would stop the current harassment. He said probably not immediately, but it would create a paper trail that could be used in court later. I drafted the complaint that night and submitted it online. The confirmation email said the review process could take 60 days. I did not have 60 days. But I had the complaint number. That was something. The twist hit on Saturday. I got a call from my homeowner's insurance agent. She said the carrier had received multiple complaints about harassment and disputes at my address, and they were considering non-renewal. I asked who filed the complaints. She could not say. But I knew. Janet. The agent said if the complaints continued, the carrier would drop me at the next renewal period. I asked what I could do. She said resolve the disputes or find a new carrier. I told her the disputes were not my fault. She said it did not matter. The carrier saw risk, and they were managing it. I thanked her and hung up. This was escalating beyond fines and notices. Janet was now threatening my insurance. That was a new level of retaliation. I called Eric and told him. He said this was actionable, and I should document it immediately. I sent an email to the insurance agent asking for written confirmation of the complaints and the source. She replied that she could not disclose the source, but confirmed the complaints were filed by a third party claiming ongoing property disputes. I forwarded that email to my attorney consult contact and asked for a revised quote. She called me back and said if the insurance threat was real, we might have grounds for a restraining order. But we would need evidence that Janet was the one filing the complaints. I asked how to get that. She said subpoena the insurance company. That would cost money. I told her I would think about it. Monday morning, I got another notice from Janet. This one was a fabricated violation notice with altered dates and recycled photos. The photos were from the contractor truck incident, but the date on the notice was 2 weeks later. The violation description said I had failed to remove unpermitted structures. My fence was permitted. I had the clearance letter. This was Janet doubling down on a lie. I scanned the notice and sent it to the management company, the board, and my attorney contact. I wrote that this was the second backdated notice and it constituted harassment under the covenant. The board treasurer replied within an hour. She said the board would review the matter at the next meeting. The next meeting was 3 weeks away. I replied that 3 weeks was not acceptable given the ongoing harassment and insurance threat. She said the board met monthly, and there was no mechanism for emergency meetings. I replied that the covenant allowed emergency meetings for urgent matters, and this qualified. No reply. Eric and I decided to force the issue. He drafted a formal demand letter citing the covenant sections on board member conduct, the incident report showing Janet's history, the backdated notices, and the insurance complaint. He included a request for an emergency board meeting within 7 days and a temporary suspension of all enforcement actions pending review. We sent it certified mail to the board president, the management company, and Janet personally. The tracking showed all 3 were delivered by Wednesday. No response. Thursday, I got a call from the management company. The manager said the board had agreed to an emergency meeting, and I was invited to present my case. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at a community center 2 miles away. I asked if Janet would be there. He said yes, as board secretary she was required to attend. I told him I would be there. Friday night, I prepared my presentation. I printed copies of every document. The incident report, the backdated notices, the clearance letter, the covenant sections, the ledger audit Eric had completed, the insurance email, the timeline of non-responses from the management company. I put it all in a binder with tabs. Eric said to stay calm and stick to facts. Let the documents speak. Do not let Janet bait me into an argument. I agreed, but I also knew Janet would try. She always did. Saturday morning, I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early. The board was already there, 5 people sitting at a folding table. Janet was at the end with a stack of orange steaks on the floor beside her chair. She saw me and smiled. The board president, a man in his 60s named Tom, called the meeting to order and asked me to present. I handed out the binders and walked through the timeline. The trespassing incident, the backdated notices, the contractor harassment, the fabricated easement claims, the insurance threat. I showed the ledger audit and pointed out the discrepancies. Tom listened and took notes. The treasurer asked questions. Janet sat silent, her face tight. When I finished, Tom asked Janet to respond. She stood up and said everything I presented was taken out of context. She said the notices were legitimate, the dates were correct, and the enforcement was justified. She said I was a difficult homeowner who refused to follow the rules. Tom asked her to address the backdated timestamps. She said the timestamps were when the violations were observed, not when the notices were mailed. That made no sense. Tom asked her to clarify. She said the system auto-generated the dates, and sometimes they were wrong. Tom asked if she was saying the HOA system was unreliable. Janet backpedaled. She said the dates were correct, and the system was fine. Tom looked confused. The treasurer asked to see the original enforcement file. Janet said it was at her house. Tom asked why she did not bring it. Janet said she did not think it was necessary. Tom said it was absolutely necessary, and the meeting would recess until she retrieved it. Janet looked panicked. She said it would take 30 minutes. Tom said we would wait. Janet left. The room was silent for a moment. Then the treasurer asked me about the ledger audit. I let Eric explain. He walked through the entries and showed how the fees did not match the covenant schedule. He showed duplicate entries. He showed an enforcement action dated before my purchase date. The treasurer looked sick. She said she had never seen the detailed ledger, only the summary reports Janet provided. Tom asked who else had access to the ledger. Eric said typically the management company and the board secretary. Tom asked if the management company had flagged any discrepancies. The manager, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, said no discrepancies had been reported. Tom asked why not. The manager said he relied on the board secretary to flag issues. Tom looked at the treasurer. She shook her head. Tom said this was a serious problem, and they needed to audit the entire ledger immediately. The treasurer agreed. Janet came back 45 minutes later. She did not have the file. She said she could not find it. Tom asked how she could not find a file she claimed to use regularly. Janet said her filing system was complex. Tom said that was not an acceptable answer. He asked if the file existed. Janet said of course it existed. Tom asked her to produce it within 48 hours. Janet said she would try. Tom said trying was not good enough. He said if the file was not produced, the board would assume the enforcement actions were invalid and vote to remove them from the record. Janet started to argue. Tom cut her off. He said the meeting was not a debate, and the board had the authority to make this decision. He asked if there were any objections from the other board members. The treasurer said no. The other 3 members, who had been silent the entire meeting, shook their heads. Tom said the motion carried. All enforcement actions against me were suspended pending production of the file. If the file was not produced within 48 hours, the actions would be voided and removed from the ledger. Janet stood there, frozen. Then she grabbed her stakes and walked out. Tom asked me to stay. He apologized for the harassment and said the board would conduct a full review of Janet's enforcement actions across the entire neighborhood. He said if other homeowners had similar complaints, they should come forward. He gave me his email and said to contact him directly if Janet retaliated in any way. I thanked him and left. In the parking lot, Eric was waiting. He said it went better than expected. I agreed, but I also knew Janet was not done. Monday, I got an email from the management company. The enforcement file had been produced. It was incomplete. Several pages were missing. The photos did not match the dates. The property descriptions were inconsistent. The manager said the board had reviewed it and determined the enforcement actions were invalid. All fines were voided. All notices were retracted. I was in good standing. The email included an apology and a request to sign a release. I forwarded it to my attorney contact. She said the release was standard, but I should not sign it until the board took additional corrective action. I asked what she meant. She said the board needed to send a written correction to the entire neighborhood, notify the insurance company that the complaints were baseless, and remove Janet from any enforcement role. I emailed Tom with those requests. He replied that the board was already working on the first two and they would discuss the third at the next meeting. I said that was not good enough. Janet needed to be removed immediately. Tom said the board did not have the authority to remove an elected officer without a vote of the membership. That would take months. I told him I would file a formal complaint with the state if Janet was not removed. Tom said he understood, but his hands were tied. I hung up frustrated. The final showdown happened 2 weeks later. Janet showed up at my side yard along the fence line with a string line pulled tight. She said she was conducting her own measurement, and if I was over the line, she would file a new complaint. I asked who authorized her to be on my property. She said the covenant gave her access for enforcement purposes. I told her the board had suspended all enforcement actions. She said the suspension was temporary, and she was gathering evidence for when it was lifted. I called Tom. He did not pick up. I called the police. The dispatcher said an officer would be out shortly. Janet kept measuring. She called out numbers. She said my fence was 3 inches over the line. I asked her to show me. She pointed at the string. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I asked her to state the setback requirement from the covenant. She said 15 feet. I asked her to show me where the 15-foot line was. She pointed at the string. I asked how she determined the property line. She said she used the survey stakes from the original plat. I asked where those stakes were. She pointed at an orange stake she had planted. I asked if that was an official survey stake. She said it was close enough. I told her close enough was not a legal standard. She said the HOA had discretion. I asked her to cite the covenant section that gave the HOA discretion to override a legal survey. She could not. The officer arrived. I explained the situation to the officer. I showed him the board email suspending enforcement actions. I showed him the recording of Janet claiming authority she did not have. The officer asked Janet if she had permission to be on my property. She said the covenant gave her standing. He told her that was not permission. He asked her to leave. She refused. He told her if she did not leave, he would cite her for trespassing. She said she was an HOA officer conducting official business. He said that did not give her the right to trespass. She demanded to see his supervisor. He called it in. His supervisor arrived 20 minutes later. Janet repeated her argument. The supervisor listened and then told her the same thing. Leave or be cited. Janet finally left. But before she did, she said, "I do not need proof, I have paperwork and vibes." The same line from the first confrontation. I had it on video now. The officer asked if I wanted to press charges. I said no, but I wanted the incident documented. He wrote a report and gave me the case number. 2 incidents now. A pattern. The next day, I went to the management company office. I walked in with my phone and asked to speak to the manager. He came out, and I told him I needed to confirm the enforcement record on camera for my legal file. He looked uncomfortable, but agreed. I started recording and asked him to confirm that all enforcement actions against me had been voided. He confirmed. I asked him to confirm that the backdated notices were acknowledged as errors. He confirmed. I asked him to confirm that Janet's enforcement authority had been suspended. He hesitated. I asked again. He said the board had suspended her authority pending review. I asked when the review would be complete. He said he did not know. I asked him to confirm that the insurance complaints filed against me were baseless. He said he could not comment on insurance matters. I told him the insurance company had confirmed complaints were filed by a third party claiming ongoing disputes, and those disputes had been resolved. He said he would notify the insurance company. I asked him to confirm that on camera. He did. I stopped recording and thanked him. He looked relieved that it was over. I left and uploaded the video to a secure cloud account. That was the trump card deployment. A police incident number from a prior HOA trespass attempt that shows a pattern, combined with a recorded confirmation from management. Janet's timeline was now proven false with timestamps. The evidence trail was complete. A week later, the funny karma beat happened. Janet showed up at the next board meeting with her printed packet to present her case against me. She stood at the podium and started reading. The packet was thick, stapled, highlighted, full of her fabricated evidence. Halfway through her presentation, a gust of wind from an open door caught the packet and sent pages flying across the room. Janet scrambled to collect them. The pages were out of order. She tried to keep reading, but she had lost her place. The board president asked her to submit the packet in writing and sit down. Janet's printed packet went airborne in a gust of wind at the worst possible moment. The room was silent, except for the sound of papers rustling on the floor. Janet sat down, her face red. The treasurer stood and presented the ledger audit findings. Multiple discrepancies, duplicate entries, altered dates, fees that did not match the covenant. The board voted to void all enforcement actions tied to those entries and to refer the matter to the HOA attorney for review. The motion passed unanimously. Janet abstained. The board president then presented a motion to send a written reversal from management with a real citation to all homeowners, notifying them of the voided enforcement actions and the corrective measures being taken. The motion passed. Janet was removed from all enforcement duties pending the attorney review. She stood up and walked out. Nobody stopped her. The HOA sent the written correction 2 weeks later. It was mailed to every homeowner in the subdivision. It outlined the enforcement errors, the voided actions, and the steps being taken to prevent future abuse. My name was not mentioned, but everyone knew. Neighbors I had never spoken to stopped me on walks and said they were glad someone finally stood up to Janet. One couple said they had been fined for a mailbox color, and the fine was also voided after the audit. Another homeowner said Janet had tried to force them to remove a garden shed, and it turned out the shed was fully compliant. The stories kept coming. Janet had been targeting people for years. The board attorney completed the review and found enough irregularities to recommend Janet be removed from the board entirely. The membership voted at the annual meeting. Janet lost. She moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. The new board secretary was a retired accountant who implemented a transparent enforcement tracking system. Fines dropped. Complaints dropped. The neighborhood finally felt like a neighborhood again. The HOA removed the enforcement action and voided the ledger entry. Karen's timeline was proven false with timestamps. The insurance carrier received written confirmation from the management company that the disputes were resolved and the complaints were baseless. My policy renewed without issue. The fence is still standing, level and square, exactly where it was always supposed to be. I appreciate you supporting the channel.